What's going on, listeners? Welcome to this season's latest episode of Can I Kick It FC? This is a special episode brought to you by 2 Cents FC. It is the Black Star Initiative and someone that's working closely with the Black Star Initiative, Mr. Maxwell Murray. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm all right. How about yourself, Yogi?
I can't complain, man. You know, I'm ready for next week because it's fall break and I'm ready to go to sleep. So I'm ready. But man, really, why we have you on the show today is to talk about all the exciting things that's going on with the Black Star Initiative, especially the project that you've been working on doing the history or collecting the history of soccer in Detroit. So before we dive into all of that, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, what you work on, and things like that?
No, yeah, of course. Well, first off, I'd like to say thank you for just having me on the show. It's an honor to be able to assist and even be able to contribute to this conversation and this project as a whole. But yeah, my name is Maxwell Murray. I'm 22. I go to DePaul University, and I am in my last year as an African and Black Diaspora Studies major. I'm originally from the city of Detroit, which is why this specific project and specific story really rings home for me, and why I'm so thankful to be a part of it and to kind of, lead the historical research as a whole, for the conversation that we're going to be having today. But yeah, grew up playing soccer my whole life at the age of 3. Have the little pictures that my mom has of me when I was, the shorts were too big and the shirt was coming down to my knees, running around. But yeah, fell in love with the game very early on. Always been involved with it. Played up until I was 18. Even had the aspirations of going on and playing at the next level in terms of college. Endured some injuries, so made the decision to still come to Chicago, explore those other areas of myself. Ended up not originally majoring in my current major right now, which is African and Black Diaspora Studies, but throughout those few years that I had away from soccer, I was able to really explore those other areas of myself and, find other interests. But yeah, so I situated on African and Black Diaspora Studies, but I was, missing the game that really, I always tell people that the one thing that I really know that I'm good at is soccer. So I was really missing out on it for those 3 to 4 years. So I figured I would try to cultivate a community or build a community that merged together both of my interests, or all 3 of my interests, honestly, which is one, soccer/football, looking at it in a more global context, Blackness and the Black liberation struggle, which is also a global context as well as domestically here in the United States. And then also just like my artistic interests and creative interests as a whole. So yeah, basically we operate in the Hyde Park community, Chicago. We hold Sunday and Thursday pickups that are completely free for the community to come join in on. Host a completely large array of different ethnicities and nationalities among the participants who come out to those pickups. Play music, get to listen to the matches on Sundays sometimes. Work with local breweries to get free beer sponsorships on a Thursday one, so we can just come out, relax, have a good time. And then our most important initiative would be our Youth Saturdays, in which we have a free Youth Saturday session, free for the kids to come out, buy them jerseys of Black players sometimes, so that they can learn the history of Black footballers both abroad and try to build that same passion that exists in countries like England, or countries such as Nigeria, Ghana, in terms of the motherland, and building that passion here. Just basically breaking down those barriers and those disconnects between Black communities here domestically in the United States and the game of soccer as a whole. So that's really what I'm focused on. But yeah.
Wow. Yeah, man, you got your hands in a lot. I'm not gonna lie. Like they say, I'm busy. Nah, man, you got me beat. So all right. So talk about this whole Detroit history soccer thing, because I'm not gonna lie, I'm very fascinated to learn about Detroit soccer, because for those who didn't know, we did an episode on Gil Heron. And when I put the episode out there, a lot of people was reaching out about like, oh yeah, you should look at Detroit Corinthians and this club and this club. And someone that's not from there, like I had no idea about all these other clubs and stuff. So, I mean, where should we start at with talking about Detroit soccer? Where is a good point for us to start this conversation?
No, yeah, you mentioning Gil Heron and father Gil Scott Heron, again merging together, football, black football, and the black liberation struggle, and just arts as a whole. But yeah, his time that he spends in Detroit, and that's kind of what really, struck my interest in in terms of the conversation of black soccer in my hometown. When I learned about Gil Heron and found out that even his burial place is there. When I go back this weekend, I'm gonna see if I can find it. But that unknown history just very easily going under the radar, not being talked about, especially as a black soccer player from Detroit. It very much rings true for me, and I just had to learn more about it. But I guess a good place for us to start would be the beginning in terms of the records. We look at the first ever record of a match in terms of Detroit dates back to the 19th century, back in 1896, going between a club from Detroit and Chicago. And, moving on from that, we go into the early 1920s. And that's when we start to really, when we are able to really start to begin to see a growth in soccer in Detroit. So what I mean by that is there obviously we have large immigration into the United States. For a little bit more context, from European places such as Poland, Hungarian immigrants, Slavic immigrants, Irish, Scottish people coming into the United States, as well as a lot of Caribbean folk. And within that, you get, they come to these cities such as Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, Cleveland, these, blue collar metropolitan cities looking for jobs. But along with that, they bring their culture with them as well. And one main element of their culture would be the game of soccer. So yeah, I guess that would be a good place to start off. This early 1920s. Yeah.
Yeah. So really, with the early 1920s, there was this inner city Midwestern soccer league. Correct me if I'm wrong, right?
Oh, yeah.
I'm right. All right. Yes. Woo! I'm right. So with this league and everything, there was also like a set of weird, or I guess not weird, but unique rules around it. Can you kind of talk about what this league was and why were those rules so interesting?
No, yeah, definitely. So, moving, as I mentioned, you have the early 1920s. You got like teams such as Caledonia or Roses FC, which I mentioned, are these ethnic clubs within the city made up of workers working in, the Chrysler or the Ford motor plants, these different automotive industries. You have these teams and they're building themselves up and they start to they participate in the amateur leagues in Michigan. They're playing in the state cup, as well as a lot of these teams participate in the U.S. Open Cup as well, which is now today known as the U.S. Open Cup, but at that time it was known as the Challenge Cup. So you had this team named Holly Carburetor FC, which in 1927, when they were still competing at an amateur level, made it all the way to the final. And they lost pretty badly to a team that had even more history than them, the Fall Rivers Marksmen up in the northeast Boston area of the United States. But yeah, you have this large history of amateur football, and then they're starting to look for opportunities to play professionally. So we have, like you mentioned, the Inner City Midwestern Soccer League, which involved three cities: Chicago, Cleveland, and Detroit. The two Detroit teams were Detroit SC and, like I mentioned, Holly Carburetor FC before. And yeah, it was organized, and the purpose of the league was, just foster and promote the playing of soccer by clubs identified within the league and to encourage the development of the game throughout the United States. But as I mentioned, some of those interesting player rules were, the league was made up. The players making up the league were allowed to be either professionals or amateurs. The players, if they deserted their club while being under a contract, they were looked at as property of the club, which I thought was very interesting. Even that verbiage or language, the word property directly. And as we mentioned before, relating to that episode that you had about slave terms within the world of football, such as, selling this player or buying this player, looking at them as somewhat of a entity in and of itself rather than a human being. They almost don't have rights, which moves into the next rule, which is, should a player be suspended for any cause, either by the league or by the USFA, which is the U.S. Football Association, his club basically can deny his right to pay, meaning that, if a player completely devoted himself to the game of football, the game of soccer, and that was his only way of, making some money, providing for himself as well as his family. If he were to run into an issue within a game and find himself being suspended, he might not be able to eat, which is very interesting. So I thought that those early rules almost tied into very traditional American imperialist thinking, and these leagues were definitely founded by white men. So that's definitely something to notice.
Yeah. So one thing I want to ask you about this real quick about the player rules was, why was it important for people to have the option to have whether or not you're a professional or amateur? If you were amateur, do you have more freedom or anything about that?
I mean, yeah, it definitely did come into a play of just like player rights, as well as also if the person who owned the club wanted to pay them or not. I've been watching this show. It's on Netflix. It's actually called The Old English Game, and it looks at kind of the birth of football in England more specifically. And the first football competition there was the FA Cup. And what I think is pretty cool, and kind of similar to how the clubs started over there in England, very similar to in Detroit as well. A lot of these clubs were started as the players they would put together a club, and they were started within coal mines or things like that. Teams for railroad workers, or on the other side of the spectrum, it would be a team for a schoolboy team, something like that. So I think when it came into play in terms of paying people, it was very much also a question of like ownership. Giving, when at the amateur level, it's looked at as just sports. That was very much the concept around sport in the past, is that you were not supposed to be paid for it. It was not looked at as a occupation or a job. Therefore, it was just activity to do, a hobby almost. But yeah, I would say that was the main reason that they would question that status of either being an amateur or a professional.
Yeah, I could definitely see what you mean with like the imperialism and the verbiage and stuff like that. And I mean, of course, this league doesn't stay around much for a long time, because by the 1930s they folded, and now you have a bunch of different leagues and teams popping up. What about this 1930s and 1940s period like stood out to you and like caught your attention? Because like in the notes that we share, like you went into great detail about this time period.
No, yeah, as I mentioned before, throughout the 1940s again, well, I would like to say that the reason that the Intercity Midwestern League actually folded again was the Great Depression. That's something definitely that you want to highlight and let people know, and a very large factor into maybe even why they didn't want to pay players. It all comes down to money. If these clubs want to travel, be able to play teams in other states, be able to pay their players as well, it all comes down to a question of money. So yeah, that league ended up folding due to the Great Depression, and then in the 1930s and 40s, you have a lot of local and ethnic clubs beginning to pop up, even more so than before in the early 1920s. Again, another reason for this is large influxes of immigration, again from like Hispanic, European, and Caribbean countries into these Middle American cities. So, like I mentioned before, they brought along with them their culture, which involved the game. Detroit soccer was known for having a good amount of like fights and almost a lack of sportsmanship, and I would almost attribute this to soccer being an international game, and then you have all these different ethnic groups coming in and playing in this new city, and almost it would make sense. It was almost somewhat chaotic. And that's what really the 30s and 40s was. It was very much a smodge podge, the word that I use, of leagues and cup competitions throughout these years. You had the Michigan National League, you had the Detroit District League, you had the Michigan Amateur League, you had various cup competitions such as the Challenge Cup as well as Michigan State Cup. So you were constantly playing matches all year. And yeah, that it was really an interesting time for the game because there was a lack of organization in terms of a nationally recognized league. But you did have a differentiating of amateurism versus professionalism, and you had B-level clubs of an A team within the same club. So it was really an interesting time and a very popular time for the game of soccer within the city of Detroit. But just again, a lack of like centralized organization around it.
So two things. First of all, I love the name the Detroit Chryslers because like I think that would be like a dope team name now. Uh, but then also like why in this time period where there's so many different league and more cup competitions? Why were there so many different cup competitions? Not so much as like, hey, we had this one league that folded. Let's try to build another league that could sustain it and build on top of what we just had.
Well, you just
Why
had a
kind
lot.
of
You had a lot of different competition and
mm-hmm,
a lot of different leagues. There were, like I mentioned, there was a lack of centrality. You had a Midwestern league. You had not even a Midwestern league, but the leagues at this time were operating by state level. So you had your Michigan league, but then you also had a Detroit District League, and then you also had a Michigan Amateur League, which is amateur league teams around the state. And then I would assume the same thing was going on in Illinois at that time, which I'm sure I'll look into when I have to research Chicago soccer. You know what I'm saying? So you had all these different leagues going on at this time, and all these very small teams of various levels, similar to if you go to England, there's not only Arsenal, Tottenham, Chelsea, West Ham, Brentford. These are not the only teams in that city. There's not only Premier League teams. There's so many leagues and so many different levels of football within England. And that was similar to how it was due to, like I mentioned, the large influx of immigrants in Detroit who were playing the game at this time. It very much emulated how the game was played in terms of the various, just the various levels and various competitions that existed. Yeah.
oh, okay. I totally get that point. Um, so I want to ask you a question. What is it that made, I guess, around the mid 1940s, you had like the Detroit Wolverines, Detroit Pioneers. What made those two teams so special in that era?
So yeah, as I mentioned, that's just that is the first time that it wasn't the first time necessarily, but it was one of the first attempts to try to centralize all of those leagues. That the Detroit Wolverines and the Detroit Pioneers, which is the team that came after the Wolverines, they were a part of this league called the North American Football Soccer League, which is the North American Pro Soccer League was a professional soccer league founded by Fred Wiseman, the league president, and league president Leslie O'Connor. It was largely a Midwestern league featuring teams from Chicago, such as the Vikings, the Maroons, and Tornadoes, as well as the Detroit Wolverines and Pioneers, St. Louis Raiders, Pittsburgh Indians or Morgan Strassers, as well as a team out of Toronto. So again, like I mentioned, rather than before where you had the Detroit Venetians playing in a league against the Detroit Hungarian Americans, against the Detroit Bavarians, against the New Detroiters, which was a team composed of refugees from all across Europe. As I mentioned before, all these different ethnic squads playing against each other within a localized area. Now you have teams representing one city as a whole playing against another city within the region of the United States. So, just larger growth as a whole. Yeah.
Okay. And do you think we're kind of seeing some of that? Not necessarily like case in foot, but do you think we're seeing some of those things being modeled today in lower division soccer? Not necessarily like MLS, but in lower division soccer where you have these clubs that are in multiple cities and stuff like that. Do you think we're kind of seeing that being played out here?
No, yeah, definitely. I would say, this first attempt to really try and do it was it very much probably is one of the stepping stools or stepping stones or just a place for learning for American soccer today. It failed. It didn't last very long. It was only from 1946 to 1948 or 1947, honestly, because the 1948 season didn't get played due to only 3 teams getting scheduled. Again, facing some financial hardships. But yeah, just trying to build soccer regionally. I mean, if I look at it, when I was growing up before we had Detroit City FC, I didn't really know or understand professional soccer in the Detroit area because there was no MLS team. That's all I thought existed. And I think you have to be able to, if you're going to, if we're going to begin to truly build this passion for soccer here in America and in the United States more particularly. We have to show that there are other levels of playing. We have to show that you can work your way up. We have to introduce promotion and relegation at a certain point so that the teams that are in the division that would be directly below the MLS have a chance to work themselves up. I think the issue is that a lot of those teams are affiliated with the MLS team. Therefore, it would be weird having a U23 squad playing their first team. But you have to, there's enough clubs in the country as a whole to be able to introduce these various systems that allow teams to grow and move up. And I think the early platforms or the early attempts to have professional soccer here in the United States understood that due to having due to the leagues being started by mostly, people who weren't American directly.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. You talk about the promotion and relegation thing. We can probably talk about that for days on end. But I mean, yeah, you just made excellent points. I can't even add anything to that. So another club that I want to ask you about, Detroit Corinthians. This club is probably outside of Detroit City FC, they're probably one of the most recognizable club in Detroit soccer. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I would say so, and I would say that is very much largely in connection just to Gil Heron and him playing for the club as well. I had a good amount of points on the Detroit Corinthians just due to his influence on the team. But yeah.
Yeah, so if you want to hear more about Gil Heron, definitely go check out episode 8 of Can I Kick It? We did a whole episode on him. So, but a different person, a different Heron that played with him was Cecil Heron. I did not realize he was a Michigan State kicker as well. That's kind of interesting to me.
Also interesting that he went to college. He went to Michigan State in his upper 30s, I believe. He wasn't there in the time between the ages of 18 and 22. So.
And he was the kicker. Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Just real quick, what made Detroit Corinthians so popular? Why were there so, almost 50 years of existence with the club?
Well, one, they existed in 3 different cities, if I'm not wrong. Again, just throughout my research, the earliest time that I was able to find a team named the Corinthians in the Midwest area was in Chicago in 1917, but in the later half of 1917, it was mentioned that they might have moved to Detroit. And then in their later years, they ventured into Windsor, Ontario, Canada, which is very close to Detroit, just a quick trip across the Ambassador Bridge or through the tunnel. So, not too far off. And then they ventured into London, Ontario, which is more suburban. So I would just say the team had a long lifespan just due to one, operating at various league levels, not folding, and being almost like a traveler's team, moving to different cities, probably being somewhat insular in terms of the people who play for it, and it not having so much hierarchy that someone owns it directly and it just can fold, but it's more just like a social club in a way, I would assume. Yeah.
Okay. So we can fast forward a little bit. I know, I'm really stuck in this little top here, but we can fast forward a little bit to the 1960s. And I think there's two competing. Are these two competing leagues, or are these two leagues that one folded and the other one popped up in the U.S. Soccer Association, which is named USA, and then the National Pro Soccer League?
No, yeah. So they were two, as mentioned. After we have there's somewhat of a hiatus within the United States in terms of a centralized league that people play in, that soccer players are playing in. It goes back to very much just like those small teams, small clubs playing. Um, a lot of it is on the East Coast with the American Soccer League, which existed for 50 years, 1933 to 1983. But again, there's just like a lack of centrality, lack of organization, lack of funding through from like the late 50s into 1967. But 1967, like you mentioned, the USA and the NPSL, they were two competing leagues. The USA was a football and baseball was a league compromised of football and baseball owners wanting to market the new sport. For example, the Detroit team was owned by William Clay Ford, as well as Detroit Tigers owner John Fetzer. And yeah, what they would do is they would completely import teams from Europe into the United States, which I thought was pretty interesting. So like Chicago Mustangs were actually Cagliari out of Italy, or the Detroit Cougars were made up of the Northern Irish club called Glentoran FC. So yeah, that was one league that operated very early in 1967, and then you also have the NPSL, which was a much smaller league, very similar to the ASL, and they were slightly competitive. They merged together to create what we had to create the NPSL. So yeah.
So why I know Detroit Cougars. They were a very popular club. I'm assuming during this time, and they had a couple of black stars. Why were players such as like Sam Aqua so important to Detroit, not only to the Detroit Cougars, but also to Detroit soccer as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, just for black kids coming out of Detroit, it's very well. First off, what I've noticed is that a lot of these players they weren't native to America. They were either Caribbean, a lot of them being Haitian, or African. Sam Aqua was Ghanaian. So these were players coming to the United States just for the opportunity again to play professional soccer, to get paid for what they love to do. But yeah, I would say Sam Aqua, these players are very influential just because they represented global blackness in a majority black city. Detroit has always been a majority black city. However, the resources within the city have always, I would say, been dominated by the minority, which is white counterparts. Detroit's a very black and white city. You have the inner city of Detroit, very centralized black populations, and you have Metro Detroit directly around it. It's like a square or a circle, and you have Metro Detroit around it, and that is where all the suburbs are. So it's like a lack of wealth inside, and then all the wealth is on the outside. So just knowing that you had black pioneers within your city who came from another place and were looking for that opportunity the same way that you're looking for opportunity, it's very influential, especially for me, learning about these players. It showed me that, learning about Gil Heron and the fact that he and Cecil Heron and Claude Bartholomew and Edna Breton, John Claude Desir, all these different players who had some time within the city that I call home. It showed me that I don't stand alone, which was a thought process that I definitely had being a black soccer player for a long time. Yeah. And I'm sure.
I think a lot of people have had those same thoughts, like, "Oh, I'm the only one doing this," and then you realize you're like, "Oh, I'm not alone."
Yeah. So also the history of it, it's very, like I mentioned, just that history is very influential.
Oh yeah. Before we go further into the rest of the Detroit soccer history, I want to ask you this question, because you mentioned clubs like Detroit Corinthians, you talked about Detroit Cougars, all these affluent clubs with these great players, and I'm pretty sure they're doing all of these leagues. Why is it that these clubs just folded the way how they did? And you think about Detroit in these time periods where, you had General Motors, you had very affluent businesses and businessmen and women. Why was it someone able to put their hand into the club and be like, "Hey, I want to keep this club afloat"?
I would say that it, a lot of when I was reading through a lot of this, doing a lot of research on these different teams, it always mentions, attendance and as well as just the context that surrounds it. You know, going back to the earlier years in the 1920s and stuff like that, you look at I read the newspaper clippings, and it's always like we mentioned already in the conversation. The communities that were keeping these leagues afloat were immigrant communities, people that were already, probably very much working hard and consumed with things in their personal lives. And football, soccer just provided them a space to just enjoy themselves, forget about things, things like that. But I think about, even at comparing MLS players' salaries to European players who are playing in Europe and their salaries. It's obviously growing, but there's definitely a contrast. And going back to these early American leagues, I couldn't imagine these people being paid anything too much. Also, that ties in the fact that a lot of the clubs were, like you mentioned, owned by things like General Motors, stuff like that. But they were workers for these companies already. Therefore, again, I can't imagine that they were being paid too much. So yeah, I would just attribute it to a lack of knowledge around the sport in people who were already from America, as well as a lack of attendance at the matches and things like that. You know, as well as the fact that people have to just start, soccer isn't everything in life. Although we would love it to be sometimes, we would love to just play soccer all day. People have to pay rent. And if that's not cutting it, then you have to find something else to do, which is what a lot of these individuals ended up doing after their careers, because at that time, you weren't getting paid millions and millions of dollars to kick a ball in the net. It was just very much, if you were good at it and really loved it, that was something that you did. So yeah.
Yeah, that's very true. I guess the time was different then. I mean, once again, like it always seemed to happen with Detroit. Like if like one team folds and closes down, or a league folds and closes, another one kind of pops up in their place. And then with I could never get the acronym right, but in NASL, when they came along, the Detroit Express came. And with them came like world players like George Best, Bobby Moore, Trevor Francis. What was it about having like that collection of players, that collection of talent in Detroit playing 2 or 3 years at this club?
Oh yeah. So and the NASL also lasted for a while. The team in Detroit only 3 years. But yeah, the NASL, which is the North American Soccer League, which even was the birth of what we have today. In terms of inspiration for the leagues and everything that featured New York Cosmos having Pele, Franz Beckenbauer, Johan Cruyff, all these incredible international players. That was one of the strongest attempts to really build soccer in America. And you had the Detroit Express, but one thing about players like George Best, Bobby Moore, they were only players brought along on a European tour in 1978. So they didn't actually play with the team throughout the NASL season, but as the team took a European tour due to the coach and owner being from England, you know what I'm saying? So again, even here you see Detroit soccer being very much headed and almost supported on the backs of another immigrant community who lives and breathes the game if you were to go to their home country. So, but yeah, you have these players being brought along on European tours. You had Trevor Francis, who was the Detroit Express's all-time top goal scorer. But he was only there on loan seasons from clubs such as Birmingham City as well as Nottingham Forest. So yeah, like you look at this and you realize like there's always a rebirth of it, but it's just whether it can last. And in order for it to last, it has to have resources behind it. And the resources are not only money but also people. The team ended in Detroit because of lack of attendance numbers. So that's what I'm saying. It just has to be a good balance of it all. And now today we finally have good markets where you have Detroit City FC, which is not even in MLS, and I would say a perfect model for it, even better than a lot of MLS teams. But it just took time. It took time to build that passion within a native community here, which is what we're trying to do right now. Build that natural connection and understanding to the game for our own communities, Black communities. As like we mentioned earlier in the conversation, for me at least, I was always, for the most part, the only Black kid on my team. I talked to you last week about it, and we're almost getting, along with us learning more about soccer, learning the history of Black players within the sport. It's almost like us getting more connected to like our roots outside of who we are as Americans, and we have to realize that Americanism was forced on us in a lot of ways, So it's just finally that passion is starting to be cultivated in a organic and natural way, rather than so forceful and so reliant on money.
Yeah, man, you make some really strong, interesting points. Before we talk about the Black Stars that were on this Detroit Express team, I want to ask you this question. Being in the city of Detroit, of course, you have the Tigers, you have the Pistons. Was there any overlap or kind of like a working together, like you kind of see now in modern sports, where all the sports here were kind of work with each other, or it was kind of like, we're going to stay in our lane, you stay in your lane, and we won't intermix or mingle?
Trying to think back. I would only go to games. I would only go to like Tigers games, honestly, growing up with my dad. I went to a few Pistons games, but no, honestly, here's another issue, and maybe that we could attribute this to like the downfall of the Detroit Express. Their home field was in Pontiac. It was at the Silverdome. That's a 40-minute drive outside of the city, similar to a club that exists here in Chicago right now, or Chicago Fire. They used to play in Bridgeview. Now Chicago House plays in Bridgeview. I think that slightly takes away from something. You want your home stadium to be in the city that you live in. You don't want to have to drive far away because, again, you're reliant on something. But yeah, I would say I would attribute that to it. I would, yeah. There's just so many factors. Yeah, there's so many. There's so many.
Yeah,
the list could go on
and
on.
Yeah, no, I definitely get you about like, you want the club that you like or the team that you like to be in the city.
But
not like, I gotta drive an extra hour away to get there.
Just going back to the original question, like in terms of like a communal space around sports, like the Pistons, they played in Auburn Hills when I was growing up. Now they play at Little Caesars Arena, where the Red Wings also play at. But all these teams had different stadiums, so it created a break off. So no, it wasn't necessarily the most connected, but I think that just again attributes to early 2000s Detroit and the lack of resources that were in the city and the neglect that was placed on the city. There wasn't much there when I was growing up. You kind of did have to go out of the city in order to do anything, such as see anything, because when I was growing up, if you were in downtown Detroit, it was nothing there.
Wow.
It was nothing. Now it's a very, very, very different. Very different. Every time I go home, I see something new. But like in downtown Detroit, when you were like, there was not stuff to do downtown except around Christmas time, going to campus marches or going to those sport games. So the sports very much, the sports teams within Detroit are very important and essential. Sure, you've seen Detroit Lions fans, and you would question why that they are still Detroit Lions fans at this point.
And you know what? When we were talking about Detroit teams, I totally forgot to mention the Lions because I just didn't think anybody cared. I'm so sorry, Detroit.
But
I just totally forgot all about it.
But it's very important, and it goes with the essence of Detroit, which is losing and trying again. And you can see this within even Detroit soccer. It continuously folded, but came back. There were always teams within the city. It has had its, its downfalls, but it always comes back up again. And you can even see that within youth soccer in Michigan. I would say youth soccer in Michigan is played at a high level. The teams that are coming out of Michigan are good. It's not.
Yeah. Yeah. So get it back on track. I'm sorry for distracting you with that question. I had to ask. So let's talk about some of these black stars that were at Detroit expressed at this time period. And like you mentioned before, it's not a lot of Americans that are playing for Detroit. It's a lot of Caribbeans, a lot of Africans, and I know that attributes to the immigration part. But were these players kind of looked at as to be that connecting force, knowing how big the black population in Detroit is?
I wouldn't assume so. No, I would say that these teams were just looking for players, and these players were looking for opportunities. I would say that if they were looking to be connectors, then there would have been black players, like they would have been black American citizens. And I think that all we can attribute that to is the lack of knowledge or just playing of the game in black communities up until that point, up until like the early 60s, late 70s. You know, you're not really seeing too many native black Americans even on the US national team until, 70s, 80s. So I would just say, that they weren't really looked at as being a connecting point. They were just looking for an opportunity, and those teams needed players. Definitely these American leagues, they needed players because if you look at any of these NASL rosters, if they're American, they're a white individual. And then a lot of the white individuals are honestly from Ireland, Ukraine, Poland, Hungary. And then, you have a lot of Latin Americans as well getting introduced into the league, for example. His name is Pato Marjoric. He was the replacement for the top goal scorer for the Detroit Express when he just chose to stay in England, Trevor Francis. So, you had, just like today, you see American, in order for the game to survive here, you have to have the influence of others. But again, it's a world game. And I think that, you see, if you go to England, those teams aren't composed of only English players. They're from all around the world. It's just because the game is played at the highest level there. But, that it was similar at that time. Then, you had people coming from all around the world just looking for that opportunity because it existed here.
Yeah, that's very true. And one thing that you mentioned before we, wrap up, you mentioned how Detroit is a place of where if something doesn't work, if we look at it as a failure, where other people might look at it as a failure, we look at it as an opportunity to try it again. And even with the Express going down and NASL going away, you still had the Detroit Rockers, you had Detroit Ignition, and now finally you got Detroit City FC. What is it about? Hey, you can also talk about what makes Detroit City FC so special, but what is it about Detroit in soccer that is always like this up and down relationship with you guys?
Like I said, it's that it almost follows the triumphs and downfalls of the city in and of itself. Detroit is a true American love story. It was looked at as a place of it. The country very much relied on it at one point in time in terms of the automotive industry and everything. In the early, I'm sure, and then it gets hit super hard by like Great Depression and everything like that. It's a very American city, but in and of that, you had a lot of people who, like I'm going back to it time and time again, who weren't American, who built up the city, in and of it being black people. We have to look, like I said, keeping that, I think I said in that, not American like we are, but we are not. So recognizing that we aren't, like I mentioned, it's a super, super, super tough relationship, and it follows the triumphs of the city. But sorry, I got caught up on that one. I don't know if I can edit it out, man. My fault.
No. You're totally fine. Look,
my fault.
No. I'm not gonna edit that out because, like, the passion you have for it is what is needed. And like Detroit, like it's like for those who don't know, like Detroit soccer is like this hidden gem that not a lot of people know about. Not a lot of casual fans know about because their first experience if they don't know about soccer, is one, why doesn't Detroit have a major? No, let me correct it before Detroit City fans come here and burn my podcast. why why aren't Detroit in MLS? Which is looked at as the big league. Well, because Detroit City FC. Okay, well, why aren't they in it? And then once you start kind of chipping away, you start trying to figure out like, oh, this is why, and this is why, and this is why. So I appreciate the passion. I don't want you to think like,
I think it shows like a passion for the game. Honestly, that's one thing that it shows, but it also shows like a wanting to do it like our own way. It's when it comes to Detroit City FC, and even you look at Detroit Corinthians, and at that time in the 30s and 40s, all those different leagues, and a lack of we were never going to not play the game, no matter if it was nationally recognized or at the smallest level. They were playing games at like Mack Park off of Mount Elliott, at Northwestern High School. These places that when I was growing up, I would have never imagined that professional soccer games were being played. So that shows that there has always been a passion for the game within the city. It's just more so the history of it being acknowledged, I think. And that might be the reason why, we didn't have that the history being acknowledged and carried on. Maybe that's why the teams continue to fold it. A lack of cooperation and community around it. One of the things that makes Detroit City FC so strong, I would say, is the fact that a lot of they don't have one owner, they have 5. And they're all from, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that they're all from the city of Detroit, or its metro Detroit area at least. And the one that I know directly and have a relationship, David DeWade, he played the game growing up, so he understands what the game needs. He understands what's lacking here in America when it comes to the game of soccer and football. He understands that one thing that Detroit City FC and its supporters have a very great understanding of is just like giving back and valuing the community that gives them life. It's a give and take relationship. So that that's why I say that passion has always existed in Detroit City FC. They understand that they have a perfect balance of that passion. It's not too much on either side. It's not too much the fans. It's not too much the owners. Everybody has the same exact level of passion for the club. Therefore, it's going to move forward. Whereas maybe you have in MLS, those owners might not have as much passion as the fans. They might just be more focused on the dollars. I don't know. So.
Okay. So before we wrap up, man, I want to ask you a couple of questions. Because who else is better to ask about Detroit soccer history than you? So if you had the ability, if you could bring one of these former Detroit clubs back, who would it be and why?
I would like to see something that existed almost like the 1920s and in the 1930s and 40s, where there were tons and tons of these ethnic teams playing in these localized Michigan professional and amateur leagues. I think that's super cool, and it's almost like what I'm trying to create with the Urban Football League. So you had these teams such as the Detroit Bavarians, which were Germans. You had, as I mentioned, the New Detroiters, which were a team composed of European refugees coming into Detroit, just trying to survive, and they played soccer as well. So that was how they, found joy in their lives at that point in time. You had the Hispanos, which was a team composed of Mexican-American immigrants located in Southwest Detroit. So I think that one really carries the culture of who these people are and who they are at home. And I think that it also, it builds up passion and community within the city in and of itself.
Word, most definitely, man. Well, Maxwell, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time of your day to talk to us about Detroit soccer history, man, because I'm not going to lie, for someone that really didn't know a whole bunch, I feel like I'm super well informed now. And, I hope Detroit soccer sticks around for the long term and doesn't fade out in the next 5 years, but they have another club come out.
No, I would love to see more clubs come out of the city of Detroit. Like that's what you need. You know, you need at every level. You know, if they want to bring an MLS team, that doesn't mean it has to take away anything from Detroit City FC, and that's how it is in you know, places where soccer, football has the greatest passion around it. There are teams in those cities at every level, and each one has diehard supporters. You know, that's what you want. You want small, big, medium, everything.
Very true. Very, very true. Anything else before we wrap up now? You've been such a great guest on the show.
No, not too much. I appreciate you having me on the show. I apologize for the amount of times that I probably said but you know, it was a great time to just come on and talk about my hometown and the thing that I love to do in my hometown. Talk about the place where that love was birthed. You know, if it wasn't for Detroit, I might have not been a soccer player. So.
I feel you. Well, as always, listeners, you can check out the show and other past episodes on our feed. Go back, listen to them. Season 3 is starting up now. This is kind of technically episode 1. So sit back, enjoy. We got a lot of stuff for you guys on the docket. As always, follow us on Twitter at CIKIFC. That's Can I Kick It FC for those who didn't know. I'm your host, Elliot. We'll check you guys later on the flip side. You guys have a great night.